our business model is focused on the technology. So we have in the group we have about a dozen patents. Urban Airport has about 8 patents, and these are pretty significant patents, which allows us to have this ultra compact footprint, allows us to have integrated MRO, allows us to land aircraft in the safest position elevated, and using our vertical airfield to bring them down to where passengers can safely and securely board, and cargo can be loaded.
Welcome to Sustainability in the Air, the world's first podcast dedicated to sustainable aviation. I'm your host, Shashank Nigam, the CEO of Simplifying. Every Thursday, I have important conversations with top aviation executives, technology entrepreneurs, and policymakers helping aviation take climate action. Conversations that help separate the signal from the noise. Whether you are a frequent flyer or an airline executive, if you care about sustainability or simply love traveling, welcome aboard. My guest today is Ricky Sandhu. Ricky is an urban airport founder. Literally, that's his company, the Urban Airport. They make, let's just say, the helipads of the future for eVTOLs. They have done their initial tests in Coventry in the UK already. Ricky has an architecture background and worked on what is considered one of the best airports in the world, the Hamad International Airport in Doha. And now he is applying his design thinking to the future of urban transportation, specifically with eVTOLs. Ricky and I have a fantastic conversation, and I learned a thing or two that I did not know already about these exciting new innovations. Hope you enjoy this interview. Ricky, great to be meeting you in person today on our floating studio in the Regent Canal. Welcome to the show. You have an architectural background, if I recall right. My team, when they did the research, they said, "Are you sure you want this guy?" It's like, yes, he's not even an aviation guy, and neither was I. What inspired you to found Urban Airport? What's the vision?
Right. So my background is I trained as an architect, and I worked at one of the leading design practices in the world called Foster & Partners. I was the youngest equity shareholding partner there, and I worked on many projects around the world. I opened side offices in Sweden, in Hong Kong, and my last project actually was a project in Qatar, and it was for Qatar Airways. It was their airport expansion, and at the time,
for Hamad
International Airport, right?
And what was your role in there?
So I was a partner in charge. So that was my project. So I initiated it in London. I used to fly to Doha and then became close with the client team there and the CEO. And what was really interesting about that project was it was the fastest growing airline in the world.
Yeah.
And the CEO wanted to double the capacity of the airport, which had just opened, without disrupting the 2 runways, right? So it was like, double the size of the airport, but do not impact my bottom line with their flight schedule. So that was like super exciting. So I was doing that, but then I was also flying back to Sweden, and I was working on the largest construction project in Europe, which was kind of to do with transportation, high-speed rail, metro, a hydrogen bus station.
And what was this project, like a transport hub?
It's a transport hub in Slussen, and it was all kind of at the where Gamla and where Sweden kind of first grew from one of the oldest parts of Sweden. And so it's super complicated urban project, and then a super challenging aviation project. And those were my last 2 projects when I was working there. And then that led me to think, actually, there's something that I can merge these 2 skills, bring aviation to cities.
Interesting.
And then we ended up setting up Urban Airport and picking up some very exciting first new clients.
Wow.
Which was, yeah.
I want to, there's so much on unpack here. Just, if I recall right, Foster Partners are the same guys who are going to be developing the Riyadh airport as well.
Correct.
Isn't it?
Yeah, it's my old team. Yeah.
There you go. So I can see the sync between Doha, Hamad, and now Riyadh as well. So that's very interesting. So you've done airports, you did this transportation hub. How did that birth the idea of urban airports, or vertiports as it's usually known as?
Yeah, so what we wanted to do, I wanted to kind of pivot away from the world of just architecture, because architects, they only have the luxury to focus on the building. They never really, in 99.9% of the projects, have the luxury to focus on the space in between the buildings, and and that's where my passion lies. What we want to do is transfer all of the kind of technology and innovation that I've personally put in, but also many other architects also put into the building space. I wanted to transfer that into the transportation space. And so that was all to do with how can we clean our air? How can we have more sustainable transportation systems? And that led to our first encounter with Airbus. And Airbus approached me and they said, look, we're designing these new types of aircraft. This is way back, right? This is kind of end of
This
2016.
is when they did Airbus City Airbus, I
City
think.
Airbus at the time, and the Vahana at the time, and the pop-up one, which had this kind of drone connected to a mini car.
I think this is still when Paul Ermenko was at Airbus,
Right.
as CTO, leading a lot of these futuristic projects.
Correct. So it was kind of like, super kind of early days. And they said, look, we're designing these new type of electric aircraft, which are destined for cities. And, we know how to design aircraft. But they were like, but we don't understand cities. So we want you to help us understand how these are going to fit in. So that was super exciting.
This was still at Foster Partners.
No, so this is then when I'd left Foster and Partners, and I started out, in this new startup world.
Why would Airbus come to a newbie like you?
So we got to know them over a period of time prior to that, and they just liked my approach and my attitude, which was, we need to have innovative infrastructure to support these innovative new types of aircraft. Otherwise, they're not gonna be commercially viable, right? So you need to, and also because of the experience of designing an airport, a traditional airport, you have to understand all of the functional requirements of the aircraft, whether it's a Boeing, whether it's an Embraer, whether it's an Airbus, whatever it is. And each one, A350 and A380, each one has specific requirements. And so you have to understand the intricacies of the aircraft in order to design the building and the infrastructure to support that aircraft. So I think they loved all that. And then we came together and we basically, in 2017, created a fleet of vertiport. And the word vertiport didn't exist even at the time. We created a fleet of, advanced air mobility infrastructure that spanned all the 6 different transects of a city, right? So every urban city in the world is built up of 6 transects.
What
right?
are these 6 transects?
So the 6 transects are, it begins from the super urban core, so kind of in London, like in Canary Wharf or downtown in
Zone 1,
city,
I
like
guess.
Zone 1.
Yeah.
But super high-rise towers, super ultra dense. And then it kind of spans across into, I think, into Transit 3 is more like, like around here, like Primrose Hill, Maida Vale, a little bit urban, but more suburban. And then it continues to suburban. And then the final transit at the other end is the farmhouse in the countryside, right? So the entire world is kind of carved up into 6 transects. And so what we did at the time is we helped Airbus with their 3 typologies of aircraft. They had different capacities, different ranges. And so we said, look, we can put together a bit of a flight schedule which allows, different aircraft to serve different ranges, right? So kind of urban or regional. And then depending on which transit they're flying to and from, we can provide the appropriate infrastructure that fits in very cost effectively, very subtly, with minimal disruption into each location. So it was this catalog of different solutions. And ultimately that then went on to seed Urban Airport.
Very interesting. So I'm very curious now. What is the difference between a helipad and a vertiport?
Yeah, so I mean the word vertiport is a new word, right? But I think a helipad is associated now with a helicopter, and a vertiport it was just kind of a word that was kind of made up by the industry and it kind of stuck. We tried to kind of move that word to be urban airport because in the end that's what it is, right? It's an airport in an urban setting.
Is there a difference between a helipad and a vertiport or urban airport?
Yeah, I mean, an urban airport. So, urban airport, we design vertiports, and there's not that much difference in the end. I mean, I think the way that we design vertiports is very, very different, right? And I think that's how we stand out.
How is it different? Because going back to what people are familiar with and what we know is a helipad, right? And I know services. So I had Adam from Archer on the
Right.
show, and we talked about how is his eVTOL Archer different from Midnight, actually different from a helicopter service that currently is available from JFK and Newark to downtown Manhattan.
Right.
Delta Airlines already offers it, for example, and it will be good to understand. There is, let's take New York JFK to Manhattan. There's a helipad on half the buildings in Manhattan on high rises. How would yours be different, or is there any infrastructure that needs to be changed, or is just a fancy word for a helipad?
Well, no, I think there's a whole host of issues. So to try and unpack all of that, I mean, I think first of all, the space requirements are different for an eVTOL than for a helicopter. The performance requirements of the aircraft demand a different sized solution. The approach of a helicopter to a helipad is different to an eVTOL. So there's a number of things in terms of just how the vehicle approaches that piece of infrastructure. But then there's also things like passenger processing, right? So helipads aren't normally equipped with non-aeronautical revenue and duty-free and a whole kind of experience. And we think this sector is going to need that. Which is going to be important for the passenger experience, because we're not talking now about one or two or a handful of people flying in a handful of very expensive helicopters. Where the industry needs this to go is where there's many more people flying many more hours and using many midnights. And in order to do that, it's got to be an accessible, it's got to be a scalable and commercially viable proposition. So there's going to be need for more kind of passenger experience focused amenities, but then also fundamentally charging. There needs to be enough power at that location, which doesn't exist on tops of those towers. And you also need to have capacity as well, right? And that's the other thing, because eVTOLs also they're very different to a helicopter. I mean, what is an eVTOL, right? I mean, it's a flying battery, right? And so batteries are expensive and they're complicated, and so you need to get as much bang for your buck from each journey, from each eVTOL. And so that means each vertiport needs to be designed to provide the maximum throughput. And we believe that needs to happen on the smallest footprint, right? Because we understand cities, we understand airports. And if you understand cities, you know that there's a lot of complications, right? And I'm an architect by training. If there was a lot of talk in the early days, we're going to put these on car parks. It's going to be a vertiport on top of a car park. There's going to be a vertiport on top of a building. But the fundamental issue is, buildings have not been designed to accommodate additional, infrastructure on their rooftops. Even the lifting capacity, the passenger lifts aren't designed. The escape stairs will not be designed for this additional function. The energy requirements aren't there. Car parks normally have other issues in terms of resilience from a structural perspective, accessibility perspective. So in order to integrate vertiports now into our lives, right, for Adam and his amazingly stunning eVTOL to be a success, it needs to be in locations where the demand is, right, and where it needs to be accessible quickly, so that you can get as many passengers into that aircraft and get as many aircraft through a vertiport as quickly as possible, but offering an awesome service, because it's an entirely new way of traveling, and it's super exciting. But we need to make it commercially viable, and that's something which we're massively focused on.
So there's a lot to unpack here, right? One by one. When I had Adam or Joby's Bonnie, they were envisioning almost a gondola service between, let's say, Manhattan and JFK, or Charles de Gaulle and Paris, central Paris. But that means you can just show up, board the next one that's in 10 minutes or 15 minutes time. And that's a very different experience from an airport. Kind of, you
Right.
want to linger, there's dwell time
Right.
in the airport lingo that we talk about. I'm guessing there are two models here. There's the vertiport in the city center, and then there's the vertiport at the airport. And I remember talking to, I think it was the head of innovation at Seattle Airport, during the pandemic, where they were rethinking how to creatively monetize their car parks, which were all empty
Right.
at that time. And in the US, at least, car parks are a major source of revenue compared to, let's say, Asia, where it's shopping. And they said, you know what? If the top floor is a vertiport, is there that potential where top of airport car parks, the top floor can be a vertiport? Is that feasible? Is that architecturally possible?
Sure. I mean, it all depends on if it's an existing car park. Does it have the structural resilience to take this additional load? Can you get the power there? And can you fit it in? Right.
So you're responsible for charging these eVTOLs as well.
Right. Correct.
How long will it take? What's the turnaround time? In once again in industry language.
Yeah, so I think our modeling is using 15 minutes, which we think is conservative, but it's also pretty fast at the same time. And there's a lot of numbers that are thrown around, but we think that's a sensible number. And you got to remember, we have 8 people from formerly working for these eVTOL manufacturers on our advisory board, so we get a lot of
fantastic,
amazing intelligence on a lot of these aircraft technologies. So we think that's a sensible number, and we can get from a very small footprint, and we can go into the numbers in a minute. Around 15 to 16 movements an hour, so very high capacity from what is a very small footprint, right? Mm-hmm. And we'll come on to the details as to how we achieve that. But that is what's super important. So if you want to put that, an urban airport in its compact form, on top of an airport car park, totally possible. We have actually looked at versions where we can integrate this on top of a tower, but that tower is being designed as a new HQ. So it's kind of designed in, right? So that's where we think we can take this in the future. So there's a lot that you can do. But fundamentally, the commercial issues are, if you can do more with less, it's going to cost less. It's lower capex, and also for us, it means there's low operational costs, and ultimately, the 20-year or 20-year concession that the operator has of this vertiport, that's where the big costs come in. So if you can make that really efficient and cost effective, the exciting thing about that is that benefit can be passed on to the consumer, so that the ticket prices are, lower, which means more of us can fly, and then you've got a model that works.
Right. You've got a vision where you want to build 200 vertiports or urban airports in the next 5 years. What is the business model to support that, and how will you get there?
So we did the world's first fully operational vertiport in Coventry. That was almost exactly 2 years ago. Last Thursday was 2 years ago, and nothing like that's been achieved since in an urban setting. And I think that I'm going to start to answer the question by just recapping on that, right? So that was in a car park, ground-based, in the middle of Coventry city centre, next to the railway station, surrounded by UK's high-rise towers.
We're not talking Hong Kong here.
We're not talking Hong Kong, no, but still, it's complicated because they're in quite close proximity. 2-minute walk to downtown, to the Coventry city centre, surrounded by highways, and also within not only a complex urban environment, a complex airspace environment, because we were in Coventry Airport's flight restriction zone, which is adjacent to Birmingham International Airport's flight restriction zone, where Qatar Airways, funny enough, fly into a lot. So all of that had to be done in a year with civil aviation approval. We had to get the FATO certified. And remember, we were inventing an entirely new way of landing these aircraft at the time. So that all went off, hugely successful. And we've proved out a model that can provide capacity on a very small footprint. And so that for us means we're kind of able to be like a gas station. So the closest analogy for me is, in the UK we call them petrol stations. In the US, you guys call them gas stations. And that's what I think is the ultimate vision for us. And so our business model is focused on the technology. So we have in the group, we have about a dozen patents. Urban Airport has about 8 patents, and these are pretty significant patents, which allows us to have this ultra compact footprint, allows us to have integrated MRO, allows us to land aircraft in the safest position, elevated, and using our vertical airfield to bring them down to where passengers can safely and securely board, and cargo can be loaded, for instance, but where they're isolated from the airfield, effectively from the airfield area. Integrated charging, but also we can stack our hangars. So we can have hangars which are stands that stack up. So you've got a small footprint, and you can go vertically,
like a multi-storied car park.
A bit like you know those German car parking, those car storage facilities underground.
You ship the car up. Yeah,
a bit like
a
that.
Lift takes it up.
A lift takes it up. So that's what we've kind of invented. So it's an entirely new way of designing a piece of aviation infrastructure. And therefore, that means we can fit into places where other people can't. So all of a sudden, you don't need 20,000 square meters. What you need is 3,000 square meters. So we're like a sixth of the size, which therefore means we're dramatically cheaper, which means we're dramatically quicker to build, right? So there's less disruption to the community, which therefore means you might get that buy-in that is needed from planning departments much easier than if you need to kind of have a construction site for a couple of years. And so you can fit in, you've got high capacity, you're fitting into an area where there's demand, where people want to fly to. And because the operational efficiency with all the integrated functions that we've just talked about, it means that the benefit of all that saving for the operator and the vertiport owner, which might not be us, can be passed on to the consumer. And that means, you're going to fly from this one because it's closer to where you live, it gets you closer to where you want to get to, and it costs you less.
You just mentioned that you may not be the vertiport owner and operator.
Right.
So how does the business model work? Are you doing a build, transfer, and operate? Are you going to be yourself operating? Or are you just saying, I'm going to build the building and whoever can come and lease it? How does it work?
Yeah, so the easiest way to describe it is, I think, we like to focus on what we're best at, right? And we're best at design and supply. And so that's what we think is a scalable model for us, because we've developed the technology. That means we can now tailor the technology, to your vertiport needs in your town or your location. But we can also, with our production partners, build that vertiport. So it's kind of turnkey, right? So you come to us, I need a vertiport from here and here. So we design them based on what the requirements are, based on what aircraft that you'll be working with. And all the brands, we have 40 brands already kind of signed up to us. So we kind of tailor the package. We then do the full design, get all the planning permissions, get everything in place, all of that kind of, which is lots of hard work, get all that done, get it installed, and then we hand it over to the operator. Now, if you said, hey,
so
Ricky,
do you build it as well?
Yeah, so we can build it as well. So if you want us to operate it, we've got a fleet of partners, right? Because, we think people who are best at operating airports are going to be the best at operating vertiports. So there's some new partners that we can't yet announce, which is pretty exciting. But some of the existing ones we have announced globally are, we've got a partnership with Aegis, who own and operate 14 airports around the world, with Munich Airport International, who also own and operate 14 airports around the world, and they used to operate JFK under concession. Korea Airports Corporation as well. And so we've built our kind of armory, and that's growing. If somebody were to ask us to operate that vertiport, and that means we can work with our so-called competitors too, right? Because a lot of our competitors want to be the operator, and we actually don't mind, right? Because we think if they operate an urban airport, it's just going to be more profitable for them, and they'll get their return on their investment sooner, because we have a much more efficient model, which is patented. So that's how we think we can scale. And for us, it means it's a low OPEX, low risk business. But we offer all the advantages in a full turnkey solution.
It's so interesting. You've built an asset light business.
Correct.
Almost like an airline which just leases all aircraft rather than owning them. You mentioned two words which I want to dive into. One is customer and the other is competitor. Who is your customer? Is this a city or a council that is coming to you and saying, hey, build this vertiport for me? Is this a government, a national government, let's say Abu Dhabi, which is working with, again, Archer,
right,
or Joby? Or is your customer an eVTOL company which says, oh, I'm hoping to land an order, let's say in Korea. Can you help us, offer an end-to-end solution? So who's your customer? And you mentioned competitors as well. Who are competitors?
Right. So, so from a customer perspective, it's all of the above, right? So we're working with various governments, including the UK, and we will ultimately work with local authorities, but that need like municipalities. But I think there's a lot of there's still a fair time to go until we get to that point. But ultimately, we do see that. So kind of B2G, right? Business to governments who have a need and a responsibility to integrate more sustainable modes of transportation for their cities, for their economic development. UK government, for instance, have identified, 65 billion kind of upside in economic value through increased productivity by integrating advanced air mobility and starting in 2026, right? So governments are beginning to realize the value that this technology can bring. So that's really exciting. And yes, we had our first order from the US, which was from Supernal. So we work with those guys. So they're an eVTOL manufacturer, and they want to build some vertiports to showcase their product, and ultimately to build them out, to capture their market with their
Where
customers.
will these be? These Supernal vertiports?
So I think they're based in the US, so they'll start there, but they'll have multiple launch markets, and hopefully we'll be able to support them.
Okay.
But we're also working with other eVTOL manufacturers as well, and these are like double-digit billion market cap companies who and the exciting thing about that is these larger conglomerates they've got the balance sheet to not only develop the aircraft, but they very early on recognized the massive importance of also investing in the infrastructure. So there's no point having the most state-of-the-art car if you don't have the roads. In fact, in Qatar, when we were there were lots of nice cars, but the roads weren't good enough. So a lot of the politicians then actually invested in improving the road system, because they just weren't good enough for these amazing Ferraris and Lamborghinis and things. So I think that's the advantage. And I think some of the smaller startups, quite rightly, they've had to focus on getting their aircraft certified, and it's a complicated, difficult process. But it is encouraging to now see they're starting to nod towards actually, we need to turn on the infrastructure side of the conversation pretty soon, right? Because as they get closer to certification, the biggest risk is there's nowhere to land, and you can't just. These aircraft are very, very complicated, right? So, and as I mentioned before, we have a deep understanding of them, and one of the things that we're particularly focused on is the downwash and the associated outwash from these aircraft. Very poorly understood. So we've invested a huge amount of time, effort, and money.
What's the difference between downwash and outwash?
So the downwash is, when the rotors are in their horizontal position and the aircraft is about to push up or land.
It's like a helicopter.
It's like it's like a helicopter, but a helicopter's downwash is very well understood, right? So it's in the very old technology in a way, very well understood. And there's one singular kind of circumference. There's one rotor that's giving you all the downwash. Here you've got a typical eVTOL has around 8 rotors, and so each one has its own downwash. These rotors are also closer to the ground, so the speed, and they're electric, right? So the speed of these kind of flow structures it's just immense, absolutely immense. But then also, because there's 8 of them, in the front of the wing, the rear of the wing, and the tail, the interaction of each downwash. If you imagine, it's almost like there's like a funnel of downwash, a cylinder. Imagine that,
like a cyclone,
and there's one next to it, and there's one behind it, and there's one in front of it. So when that interaction happens, there's a violent, it's a very turbulent space to be in.
And is that the outwash then?
And so then the outwash is when it hits the ground, then it's pushed sideways, right? So it hits the ground, it's pushed sideways. And then, a lot of our competitors have kind of ground-based vertiports, right? Where, there's a little building to process, a bit like what we're sitting in, to process some passengers. And then it's a very traditional form of aviation planning, which I've done for many, many years, where, you then leave the building, you go into the airfield, you climb into this eVTOL, it then taxis, on the taxiway, gets to the FATO, way over there somewhere, which is the equivalent of a runway, and then it kind of takes off, and that takes up a lot of space. But all of that space means there's an infinite ground plane from an outwash perspective, and that means that this violent hurricane force winds that are created by these electrically powered aircraft, there's nothing stopping that kind of speed and that force of
I can
of
imagine
outwash.
Saturn V taking off.
Yeah, I mean it's huge. It's huge, right? I mean it's manageable. That's the thing, but it's got to be understood in order to manage it, right? And so what that will mean is you'll need more space to allow that outwash to dissipate, so that it's not gonna impact personnel. It's not going to impact.
So how do you manage that? How do you manage?
So
the
we
downwash
manage that.
and
So our latest patent that we just filed has a very special way of effectively mitigating 95% of that downwash. And there's a number of things. So number one, so we're landing elevated. So we have an isolated platform. Number one, where the Phaeto lands. So you're already elevated above, above the community or any adjacent building. So that's number one. But then within our Phaeto, and I can't go into the details, I'm not allowed. But we've built in technology whereby, because we have the vertical airfield, which is also like a cylinder, we can use that to our advantage to basically mitigate that outwash and downwash effect, which therefore means these aircraft, they can land on this tiny footprint, and that then means we can really realize the maximum throughput. Because if you don't have that and you have a ground-based vertiport, not only will you need more space for the outwash to dissipate so that it's safe for passengers to go onto the airfield and crew, and the vertiport staff, but then it's also that has an impact on throughput, right? Because if you have to wait longer for the outwash to dissipate so that it's safe for me to go to the eVTOL that I paid for, if I have to wait longer, that just means there's less throughput. So that means it's gonna hit the bottom line, which therefore means it's ultimately it could end up being a very unviable vertiport proposition or business model. And so we spend a lot of time on financial modeling, and we have a lot of data that shows that proves this, right?
Yeah,
so
it's so interesting. I'm thinking, what if in your cylinders, I'm thinking out loud here, maybe this is the 9th patent you can file. What if inside these cylinders, on top of which the eVTOL is landing, you have horizontal windmills, and this downwash spins these windmills, which generate electricity to then charge the next aircraft.
Yeah,
you're paying it forward by spinning this because of this downwash, which is so strong.
Yeah.
Can you not do that?
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, we've been focusing on the fundamentals, because, safety is number one, right? I mean, it's the most important thing. And Mike Whitaker, who's the administrator now of the FAA, he opened our vertiport in Coventry 2 years ago, and his number one laser focus is on safety. And so, that's our number one laser focus as well. But after that, it comes with, profitability and viability, right? So you've got to make it safe. But in order for it to be viable, it's also got to fit in, and there's got to be, you've got to have the financial modeling in place that supports it. And so, operational efficiency. If I go back to the Qatar Airways, CEO, I want to double the size of my airport, but do not disrupt my runways. That's the most important thing. You've got to have minimal disruption, maximum, throughput, so that you've got, the most efficient operation possible, and with that, and the same will be true from in the vertiport world. It's almost more important, right? Because you're using electric batteries,
right? It's so interesting that when you bring in infrastructure, which is where your business lies, and you bring in government, it becomes a very complex soup. Now, interestingly, I lived in Doha for some time as well, working at Qatar Airways, helping one of their new startup airlines.
Oh, right, cool.
And I was there at the time when the government had decided to build better roads for these very fast cars.
Right.
So there was construction everywhere. This is about 5-6 years before the Soccer World Cup. So I was there when the highway was built, but somebody had just thought about the cars. They forgot to think about pedestrians.
Right.
And in the end, the result was, at least when I lived there were no footpaths or sidewalks or pedestrian crosswalks in Doha. So you either have a highway where there's a Hummer speeding down and there's no way to cross, firstly, and you cannot walk by the road. You just cannot physically walk.
Right. Yeah.
So if there's a park next to your own building, which was the case in mine, you had to take an Uber from your house to the park next door because there was no way to walk there with your kid in the stroller, which is what I experienced. I remember crossing the road from Qatar Airways Tower 1 to Tower 2 was not possible. There was a shuttle bus that would take a U-turn. It would take you 30 minutes to go from...
Salwell Road.
Yeah, there you go, exactly. So those
like an 8-lane major road.
Yeah, you just could not cross it.
Yeah.
I think now they have an overhead bridge, so you can actually cross it. But there was a shuttle every 30 minutes. But going back to the point, infrastructure funded by government becomes very interesting, which I see as a potential risk for your business, because now we are seeing the German government pausing loans for the likes of Volocopter and Lilium. We are seeing funding runway getting shorter for other eVTOL players. How does this impact you when you're reliant upon government, B2G, you said, as your primary customer, and your partners, eVTOL companies like Lilium or Volocopter, potentially struggling for funding?
Yeah, look, I mean, there's a host of challenges, right? But I think, we have to solve them. I mean, we're talking about, we're sitting on this podcast, it's all about sustainable aviation. And, I think there's a lot of eVTOL manufacturers who haven't been focused on the commercial viability, right? I mean, I think we can say that. Some have, and some of the ones that we're working with are also focused on hybrid electric VTOLs as well. So it's not just only eVTOL, it's VTOL generally. And if you have a hybrid electric, there's a lot of advantages. So that's number one. That's super important. I think, as the UK government have already funded our vertiport, the one we built in Coventry, there's a precedent. And they've also gone on to say, they can see the economic benefit of advanced air mobility using eVTOL and VTOL for the UK. And I think that will be replicated in other countries, and we're getting approached by a lot of cities and a lot of governments and states and so on. But you're right, ultimately, we're sitting in London, and I was involved in HS2 in my older days, and and we know what's going on with that. Infrastructure is expensive and it's costly. And yes, there's a benefit that the state is offering its citizens and communities with better social equity, connectivity, productivity, but it comes at a cost. And so that's why it's more incumbent. And we took it very personally because we won millions of pounds of UK taxpayers' money to develop that vertiport. So it was quite a personal experience. It's a lot of my parents' tax money, my friends' families. And so we use that money to focus on something very different, which is our vertical airfield, our urban airport kind of USP. And that means that it's a cost-effective piece of infrastructure that you can scale. You can start with the vertical airfield and one hangar, right? And then you can bolt on another hangar. You can even have stacked hangars, right? So you can grow your infrastructure as you go, and that's never really heard of in airports. Airports start off, this is the kind of peak day, demand, and we're going to build everything based on that. And Qatar Airways, as the airport it was very peaky, its flight schedule. So we've got the ability here to disrupt that and provide a scalable, prefabricated, high quality, cost effective, small footprint, ultra efficient product in our urban airport to scale. And that's how you get to that 200 or more, because I see urban airports like gas stations, ultimately, and not only in the UK but everywhere. And that's how to get the best value from these aircraft as well, And I think the other thing is, from the aircraft perspective, unlike traditional aviation where you can afford the fuel to taxi from a runway or from a heliport FATO and hover taxi if you're a helicopter to the stand, or just drive taxi if you're an aircraft. We're talking about electrically powered aircraft here, and so that resource needs to be, from the infrastructure side, needs to be really taken care of. And so that's why for us, you land on the elevated FATO, safest position, pilot, passenger, and the aircraft. You switch off, we bring you down. And then where do we move you? We move you to the stand, which is the shortest possible distance to the FATO. And it's segregated, it's isolated, but it's the shortest possible distance, which means if you're the air service provider, if you're the aircraft operator, you're conserving a lot more power, and that can mean the difference between, a safe landing or a not safe landing, or, going from this town to the next, right? So all of these things add up, and I think there's a lot of we get frustrated because there's a lot of immaturity still, in this in the sector, particularly from an infrastructure perspective, and so when you're talking about governments and you're talking about their responsibility and their adoption rates, I think it's very, very important that you have a sustainable product that is cost effective and that you can very quickly reap benefit from.
Right. So let's differentiate between something that brings sustained economic benefit, which we've talked about, versus something that is sustainable in the environmental sense. And there is this frame of thought which says, you know what, these eVTOLs are shiny new toys for the super rich, for the fringe population, and they don't really make aviation sustainable. I mean, most of our emissions come from super long haul flights and wide body aircraft. In numbers, of course, narrow body aircraft as well. eVTOLs are a sector on its own, which is not necessarily reducing the amount of flying or amount of emissions coming from flights. Firstly, is eVTOL a niche category? And secondly, is it truly sustainable?
Look, I mean, I think from a sustainability perspective, it's zero emission, right? It's using electric batteries. That is all being used to offset some ground-based traditional journeys. It's not going to replace all ground-based journeys, but and nobody thinks that. So it has a role. And that's kind of from an environmental perspective. And yes, we're also using a battery, but I think the most important thing is that if you're flying in an eVTOL as opposed to taking a diesel car, you're contributing to a little bit to cleaning the air. So I think the more journeys you can get in an electric car or electric aircraft, the better, right?
So it's the overall emissions of transport rather than air transport that we're looking at.
Yeah, and I think there's So I guess that's the first one, and then I think productivity is really important. You're sitting in traffic, you're in your car, it's 2 hour journey. If you can get somewhere that normally takes 2 hours to drive in 25 minutes in an eVTOL, Coventry to London, for instance, that's going to result in you being able to do more stuff, right? So it's going to and then you replicate that across a town or a city or a country. Mm-hmm. That productivity, which is what the UK government have identified, I think is from a economic sustainability perspective is super important. And then I think it's also construction is there's lots of carbon in airports. Heathrow was in the news recently as a big contributor from an aviation perspective to air quality and emissions. And I think the building anything and construction sites, it's complicated, it's difficult, but airports particularly can be very carbon intensive. And so what we've also been focused on is if you can do something really efficiently.
So it's the compact nature of these urban airports.
It's inherently more sustainable.
You change the footprint as well.
It's like Buckminster Fuller said, do more with less, and that's what and that takes a lot of effort. I mean, we've spent a lot of time and money on these patents, but that's what the resultant is. You can get better throughput on less than a sixth of the real estate. Which and you're building this vertiport in a factory and you're installing it on site. I mean, it's just much more sustainable and sustainable long term. It's also about when buildings need to be repaired and maintained. If you're designing something in a factory and you're installing it, it's obviously at a higher quality because you've been building it in a controlled environment. And then from an energy perspective, I don't know whether you saw what we did in Coventry. We also kind of we broke new ground. We had green hydrogen fuel cells powering our electric chargers, and it was all off grid.
So it was completely green.
So it's completely green. So the other challenge here is how do we get the power to each vertiport? And so that's another aspect that we've been focused on. So it's the landing, but also the charging infrastructure.
So it's end to end infrastructure you're looking
Yeah,
at.
and it's a
goes
full
green.
comprehensive approach to sustainability, financial sustainability, social sustainability, and obviously environmental sustainability as well. So that's all built into what we're focused on, which is why we're very different to a lot of others.
It's very interesting. And tell me a bit about this LG Electronics partnership you've got, which is quite unique.
Yeah, very exciting. So we've been working with LG since 2022. They helped facilitate a lot of their technologies into the proof of concept in Coventry. But over the last couple of years, we've been doing a lot of work together, and they've seen the benefits and the opportunity of the market and the benefits in an urban airport solution. So they're going to be our preferred digital innovation partner, and that makes it easier for our customers because then we've got the full complement in one house. And that extends to battery storage, to chargers, to a lot of their cool, also revenue generating technologies, which is super exciting. Their command and control facilities, and they're even extending it to unmanned traffic management systems too. So they basically have everything from a digital perspective that any vertiport would need. So we're really excited about that because it just makes it, it makes it easier for our kind of turnkey solution if we have one partner, and that also offers benefits to the consumer, to the customers, or our clients, because then if it's all done, with us, we can. There's preferential pricing as well. So it just takes away a lot of the other complication, and you just want a vertiport, so we can just go to our kind of key partners and just give you everything.
Right. It's so fascinating. It's such a new space. You're leading it from the front, and it's so good to hear the other side of the story, the infrastructure part, downwash versus outwash. So fascinating. Where do you see this industry going in 10 years from now? What's your best case and a worst case scenario?
I mean, I think a realistic case is, is getting these aircraft certified, and I think that will happen. There's a lot of challenges still, even for Joby and for Adam and team at Archer, and they know that. But they're doing a great job. They're really focused on getting it done. And then there's the hybrid versions as well. And then there are other types of VTOLs, which may be electrical hybrid, which have less complications in terms of tilt rotors. So in 10 years, I would hope and expect to see hundreds of vertiports in a way being used like gas stations, like petrol stations. Where they're doubling up as drone ports as well for cargo, but they're also becoming embedded into our kind of psyche, into a part of normal life, and the price point being significantly lower because the uptake is dramatically higher because we're putting them in locations where people can really see the benefit of them. And when we were in Coventry, we had 15,000 people come in to the vertiport. And these are just regular folks, right, from Coventry. They're not aviation.
Curious about the future.
And they were queuing. They queued every day, 5
Wow.
times a day. They queued around the block to get in. And, when they understood that they could get from Coventry, right, which is very poorly connected from a public transport perspective and very congested. It's very car-oriented.
Because on the way to Birmingham, right?
It's on the way to
Birmingham's very well connected and Coventry is not.
Right. So if they can get from Coventry to London, which is, UK's kind of, economic kind of heartland.
Center of the world.
Center of the world, as we like to say. In 25 minutes, even like the regular person can see the benefit of that. And so I think there's a huge opportunity to better connect the world, to spread social equity, to save a lot of carbon on building new roads, building new massive airports and bridges and tunnels. Of course, that needs to happen, but vertiports can reduce
They complement everything that's happening. Right. We didn't talk about this. What about price? How much do you think will it cost in 10 years from now to take a eVTOL using one of your vertiports, for example?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question. I mean, I don't think it's going to be like an Uber that people have always said. It's going to start, as similar. The best example is Blade in the US, right? So a couple of $100 for that amazingly, that there's a huge amount of upside in paying that. But that will come down in 10 years. That would, I don't know, maybe like less than half, more or a quarter of that. Okay. But it won't be like $2 or $5 or anything like that. I think it will be affordable, and I think by then it'll be acceptable as well. But the only way to get to that affordable, acceptable price point, and there is, by the way, we've done a lot of work on willingness to pay, which is also something which gets overlooked quite a lot. And there is a lot of willingness to pay. Like, numbers are pretty high. from what we've researched. But in order to get to that acceptable price point, you've got to have efficient, affordable infrastructure.
Yep.
So if you have a big, expensive airport, guess what? The big, expensive airport is going to charge the big airline a lot more to land. And guess what? The airlines are going to charge us, the flying passengers, more to take that flight because they've got to offload their costs. So it all starts and ends, for me, with the infrastructure. Make it effective, make it efficient, make it affordable, pass that benefit on to the operator, who can then choose to pass it on to the consumer. And that's how you have a sustainable, scalable, massive industry, which is super exciting.
Fantastic. On that note, I think we should wrap up the interview, which has been so insightful for me. The final part of this interview is called the rapid fire round, in which we get to ask you simple questions and get to know you a bit more personally. So I'll start with something simple. What's your favorite airline?
Qatar Airways.
Okay, good one. Favorite airport?
Favorite airport has to be Chep Lap Kok, Hong Kong.
Okay.
Stunning. Absolutely stunning.
Have you done the new air bridge that they've got?
No.
So a bit like Gatwick,
Okay.
It goes over the tarmac, but because these are beautiful wide bodies, you can stand right above the aircraft.
Oh, cool. No,
as
I've
it
not
goes
been
right on, and they've got these beautiful sun loungers. So next time you're in Hong Kong, that's what you got to do.
I certainly will.
I'm sure you'd love it. What's your favorite book?
Favorite book is a book called The Jersey, and it's all about the All Blacks.
Okay.
The rugby team, which is amazing. And the best bit about the book that I love is they've been trying to win the World Cup. They're the best team in the world. They're trying to win the World Cup. Never won it. And then they win it. And they've just won the World Cup, right? The Rugby World Cup. But then, immediately afterwards, they are in the sheds, which are the changing rooms. And the entire team, the captain, everybody, they're sweeping the sheds. So they're cleaning the shed. Because they work as a team, right?
Yeah.
So it's not just the cleaning staff and the training staff and then the players and the captain. They all clean up, right? Which I think is...
That's why they won.
Yeah, well,
that's the reason they won.
They're the best team in the world. They're the best team in the world.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Amazing,
so I love that
amazing.
book.
That's amazing. I've seen this. I've heard this about the Japanese teams as well. They did this in the Soccer World Cup, cleaning up their rooms and, and changing rooms and things like
important.
that. What's your favorite movie?
My favorite movie, it's got to be Al Pacino, Robert De Niro, Heat.
Okay, all right. I can see the action flair there. What do you do in your free time?
Free time, we have two beautiful kids.
How old are they?
13 and 6.
Okay.
Boy and a girl. So lots of time with family and at home. And we live in a very leafy part of London. So
fantastic.
Yeah, the 4 of us.
Very nice. What is something you would like to learn, Ricky?
What would I like to learn? I was trying to learn the guitar and failed miserably.
Before you met your wife or after?
No, afterwards. No, so our son plays the drums, so I thought I'd be a cool dad and I'll buy an electric guitar. It's all kind of cool dads do. But it was a failure. So yeah, it's just in the garage. Yeah.
Do either of your kids now play that electric guitar?
I'm trying to make my daughter pick it up, yeah.
Uh-huh. There you go. What is the best advice you've received?
Best advice I've ever received will be don't worry if you don't fit in, because you were probably born to stand out.
Oh, love it. Fantastic. I'm going to frame that up. Very nice. And finally, if we are meeting 1 year from now and we are popping champagne, what are we celebrating?
We'll be celebrating in 1 year.
Yes.
Okay. I would say we'll be drinking champagne in the next commercial operating urban airport.
Looks like might be at Paris Olympics, well, or something after that. Very interesting. Ricky, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure having this chat. Learned so many new things, and I do wish you all the best.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Sustainability in the Air. Aviation is one of the hardest to decarbonize industries, yet there are multiple paths to get to net zero. Awareness is key to a green future. So please give us your support to help our sustainable aviation insights reach a wider audience. You can do this by sharing this episode on your network, on LinkedIn, Twitter, or even WhatsApp. Or perhaps you might consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to this episode. You can start a conversation with us by writing to us at podcast@eVTOL.com. Simplifying, that's simply with an I.com. And for more content on sustainable aviation, please visit our website green.simplifying.com and join the movement. Sustainability in the Air is an original podcast by Simplifying. The show is produced by Juraj Toth in Slovakia. Dirk Singer is our Director of Sustainability, who leads research for each interviewee out of Greenwich, UK. Shubhadeep Pal is our supervising editor based out of Mumbai and Singapore. The articles are written by Ayushi Badola in Dehradun in India and Meera Hull in Montreal, Quebec. Creative design is led by Ligia Esteve in Montreal. Baiba Drimain is the project director for the show based out of Valencia, Spain. Special thanks to Wendy Sim in Singapore. And I'm Shashank Nigam, the CEO of Simplifying and your host. Please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn.